I'm Bobbie Levinus, and I work for Preservation Virginia's John Marshall House. He knew that he wanted to be a lawyer from early on, and his dad was a land surveyor, knew Washington, and his mom came from good Virginia stock and was a Randolph. And so when they got married, John Marshall was the first of 15 kids. He lived in a log cabin and a couple other places that were a little bit bigger after that, but not too much, in Fauquier County, which is a couple hours away from here. And that was the frontier of Virginia. So here's this frontier boy who becomes the Chief Justice of the United States, the fourth Chief Justice, and probably one of the most influential men to date for helping form our American government that we use today. After John Marshall played a very small but very significant place in Virginia's constitutional debate back in 1788, he literally watched this house go up and had already purchased 4 lots, so he owned an entire city block. And he and Polly Marshall, his wife, as well as some of his children, moved in here. And he owned about a dozen slaves who also lived and worked on the premises. They lived in the back of the house where the laundry house was, where the kitchen was. And it was a large urban house in Richmond City. It was built between 1788 and 1790. The house itself stayed in the family after John Marshall and his wife died. It went to his daughter, and she lived a block away, so she didn't really want to move in. So she rented it out, and about the late 1800s is when her elderly daughters moved in. So John Marshall's granddaughters moved in here, and they stayed until 1909. At that time, they sold it to the city, and the city decided that they wanted to knock it down and build John Marshall High School here on this site. Early preservationists, which were women and individuals and groups, got together and said, you can't knock it down, it's too important for our nation. And so they saved it from destruction, and APVA, which then turned into Preservation Virginia, turned it into a museum to be able to restore it to what John Marshall had it when he was here. And they've been telling that story ever since. This location to Virginia is really important. It's called the Court End neighborhood. And it was up on Shockoe Hill, which is one of the hills in Richmond City. It was, if you talked to a real estate agent back then, if there were RE/MAX agents or whatever back then, they would have told you location, 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 right here. Because it was right next to the State House that had just been completed in 1788. And John Marshall knew that, and he knew this would have been the best place to live for a lawyer, a judge, a merchant, and those are the kinds of people that lived up here. John Wickham was a block away. That is now owned by the Valentine Richmond History Museum. And this was a whole residential area that people lived in. So John Marshall and Polly Marshall, his wife, and their 6 surviving children lived here, with John Marshall being able to walk to the State House for when he was a representative in the General Assembly, for when he was a top lawyer in Richmond, for when he was a federal judge serving in a circuit court duty during the Aaron Burr treason trial in 1807. Here's the Chief Justice of the United States. He's got his home right here in Richmond. He doesn't have a home in D.C. He's been living in the boarding house up there when he goes up to serve. And he has to serve circuit court duty as the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And his circuit court was all of Virginia. So when Aaron Burr went on his misadventures, so to speak, he was hauled back here 1,000 miles, back to Richmond. And the Chief Justice of the United States was called in to serve in federal court to be the judge that was to make all of the important decisions that now we use to know that treason is a constitutional definition, and John Marshall helped define it and helped to defend it. Treason was written into the Constitution, and John Marshall knew that 25 years before this case or more, that the framers of the Constitution really had an important reason why they defined treason as they did. And he knew that they had left out a very important part of treason, the treason definition, that was part of English common law. And they did it because they had seen years and years of history of the English monarchy saying to anybody who disagreed with their political beliefs, off with your head. So all of the constitutional representatives who signed that Constitution were the ones that said, we want a country that is based on free speech and being able to hold to our political beliefs. We can disagree with one another, and we can still say that out loud, and we can still have a country, and we don't have to have somebody telling us that we're going to be thrown in jail or worse for it. Preservation Virginia was started in 1889. We're actually celebrating a big anniversary this year. And what's important about it is that it was an organization started at a time when many people really had no idea what preservation or preserving historic sites was all about. So Preservation Virginia decided that they wanted to make sure that those historic sites that were important to our nation in Virginia were conserved. And so Jamestown was one of them. The John Marshall House was one of the early ones. It was saved in 1909 and then turned around into a museum by 1913. So one of the cases that is most famous, and historians will tell you John Marshall really set the Supreme Court on a course for becoming an equal partner with the other two branches of government. And yes, it wasn't an equal partner. It was very weak when John Marshall, as the fourth Chief Justice, came into power in 1801, nominated by President John Adams as he was leaving. So here's John Marshall, and he goes from being Secretary of State for John Adams to being the Supreme Court Chief Justice in 1801. And he swears in a very popular president in 1800. And his name is Thomas Jefferson. So Marshall and Jefferson immediately collide. You've got two titans of American history, and they collide over the case of Marbury versus Madison, which came to Marshall in 1801, but he wasn't able to deal with it because of Jefferson's power through Congress. They actually told the Supreme Court that they really didn't need to meet but once a year instead of twice a year. So that case didn't actually get to be tried until 1803. At that point in time, Marbury versus Madison was a case that was extremely in the news. And to make a long story short, John Marshall finessed the principle of judicial review so that the Supreme Court was the one that got to say what was constitutional in the courts and what wasn't. And that laid the groundwork for what we have today as our American constitutional government. Marbury versus Madison really was the case that helped begin the Supreme Court's ascent as an equal power with the other two branches of government, and helped really begin to establish the principle of judicial review throughout the federal court system. And while it wasn't necessarily accepted by everyone right away, it was something that Marshall used from then on to express the will of the people